Good afternoon, everybody. As I was previously mentioning, we're still waiting for one more member to achieve a quorum. If we don't get there pretty soon, we'll just start and have a conversation without, I
Mr.
guess.
Constant, I just joined. Did you see my name on the list?
I don't actually. Very good. So there you go. Ladies and gentlemen.
This is Austin Quinn Davidson.
Thanks. Welcome to the Tuesday, November 16, 2021 rescheduled Assembly Ethics and Elections Committee meeting scheduled from noon to 1. Madam Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Assemblymember LaFrance.
Here.
Assemblymember Allard. Assemblymember Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Assemblymember Kennedy.
Here.
Assemblymember Constant.
Here.
Assemblymember Peterson. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. And I am chairing today in place of Mr. Peterson, who is again attending Alaska Municipal League's conference. And we have scheduled for today a conversation with the Board of Ethics. Can we hear from members of the Board of Ethics who are here? Just introductions.
D. Ennis.
Hi, Terry Kelly.
And this is Becky Wynn Pearson.
Anyone else? Okay, so we now move on to the new business section of the agenda. I believe that the Board of Ethics wanted to present, or I'm not sure exactly what the purpose of this conversation was other than to have a nice conversation. And so maybe Dee, you have some insight?
Well, actually, the Board of Ethics was requested to attend today for discussion and updates.
Okay, and having not been the person who made that request, I'm wondering if anybody has insight as to the nature of that request or if it's just a general conversation with the Board of Ethics.
Mr. Chair, this is Erica McConnell, Deputy Clerk for Elections.
Yep.
I can provide some insight.
Thank you.
So this is the Ethics and Elections Committee, as everybody knows, but for the past approximately 2 years, every meeting has been very focused on elections, and there has not been a Board of Ethics update, which it is my understanding used to happen fairly regularly, maybe once or twice a year. So we felt that given the responsibilities of the committee, that it would be appropriate to ask members of the Board of Ethics to come and give an update.
Okay, so with that as the initial framework, we have 2 members of the commission and the staff who would like to take on giving us an update on the function of the Board of Ethics.
And Chair, we brought today a topic that we thought you'd be interested in besides just sort of minor updates. And Terry, the board chair, is going to take the lead on that.
So, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please. You have the floor, Mr. Kelly.
Great, thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, so yeah, just as a quick reminder, remember the Board of Ethics, provides advice to municipal servants about interpreting and complying with the Municipal Ethics Code and investigates complaints of possible violations of the Ethics Code. But what we wanted to talk to you today was try to get a sense of what was the will of the Assembly about the recent issue of doing conflict of interest reviews of mayoral appointees. In the past, one of the things about the Ethics Code is that you can request an advisory opinion about your own behavior. But by and large in the Ethics Code, you can't request an advisory opinion for someone else's behavior. Recently, in the last few years, we've added a section of the code that allows certain individuals to do that, though. The municipal attorney, the municipal clerk, and the ombudsman can request the board to give an advisory opinion about someone else's behavior. And it's been through that mechanism that the board has done over the last few years several conflict of interest analyses with mayoral appointees. But typically in the past, the way that worked was that you would have a mayoral appointee who recognized that they had a significant potential conflict They worked with, say, D, the ethics officer, and then they would come to the board asking for an opinion. From there, we've kind of gone from more recently, D recognizing that there's potential conflicts and bringing a request for an opinion to the board about the potential conflict of a mayoral appointee. From there, from there, it seems like there is perhaps an interest on the part of the assembly to have us do this regularly. I mean, like, and so, is the idea that mayoral appointees generally should ask for an advisory opinion, or should there be some mechanism by which the clerk or the municipal attorney asks for an advisory opinion for all of the appointees, at least let's say at this executive level position? And again, I've heard some things that make it sound like perhaps there's interest on the part of the assembly of doing that, but I want to emphasize, one, that would be a change, at least in the practice, right? I mean, there's certainly nothing in code that requires that people go through a conflict of interest opinion with us. So if we were to begin requiring that as a normal part of the confirmation process, that would be a change in practice. Our particular experience is that it might not be a bad idea to do that. We noticed in the last few conflict of interest opinions that we did that, I thought we were pretty helpful. In some cases, we found that, and you saw our opinions about the last couple appointees, that, what looked like a potential conflict, it was more of an appearance problem than an actual substantive conflict. But in a few cases, we're actually able to offer some sort of upfront and proactive advice for these appointees in terms of how they should manage themselves once they're once assuming that they get confirmed for their position. So, given that one of the roles of the board is a kind of proactive and an educational role, there is some sense to the idea that you should have these appointees come before the board as a regular process. So, on the one hand, there's educational value. The concern, I think, is the idea of politicizing and weaponizing the board, right? I mean, like, so, we don't want the board to become politicized. So in some sense, I would, I at least want to get your sense of what is the will of the assembly in this? Do you want it to be a kind of regularized process where executive appointees generally go through, asking for this conflict of interest opinion? And if so, how can we make sure that that's sort of like a regular process in which, by and large, the same kinds of expectations are held for each of the appointees? So I guess that's saying, so I guess that's my question: is what is your sense of what you would prefer, and sort of what is the wisdom and prudence of any one of these processes, namely, keep it the way it is, where it's just sort of an occasional thing that gets done when the ethics officer or the clerk or the ombudsman spots a potential problem, or should we make it a more regularized requirement of all executive appointees? Any thoughts on that? And Mr. Chair, I'm going to start with you. I mean, if you don't mind me treating this as a class for a moment, I'm going to start with you. What thoughts? I'll put you on the spot and then we'll get it going from there. Any ideas?
So I see Ms. Kennedy is attempting to put herself in the queue. Normal practice would be to defer to the members, but I will, since asked, opine that I believe ad hoc is better than everyone. I think for the most part, most people can be expected to serve and bring up their own conflicts as they see. However, some people, the appearance of conflict is enough that there is a heightened sense of need for this. And so I am not one to want to take every appointee through the process, although I certainly am of mind that every appointee should have to do an ethics training probably, and maybe even sit through some form of consultation with the ethics board in the sense that in the sense that, like, when assembly members are elected in their class, they will, if you will, they go through an ethics board conversation, but not to the level of detailed analysis of potential permanent conflicts. And so I think ad hoc is better, but I'm just one member of the body. So in the queue, we have Ms. Kennedy, Ms. LaFrance, and then Ms. Quinn Davidson. Ms. Kennedy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, just trying to get unmuted here. Thank you. Actually, I think this is actually a very interesting conversation. So I'm glad you brought it up and posed the question in that way. I guess what I would say is, first of all, as an assembly member, one of the things that I had to do in my assembly member orientation was actually get kind of a little briefing, if you will, on the ethics code. So as an assembly member, I think we're fairly well versed in that. And of course, the responsibility is, as an assembly member, that we have to at least declare potential conflicts of interest. And then, of course, we go through a little screening, if you will, on deciding whether or not there truly is a conflict. But I would assume, and maybe this is bad on my part, but I would assume that when a mayor is appointing someone, that they kind of go through that screening as well, particularly through their HR director and certainly through any of the municipal attorneys that might have the expertise in that area before they're even appointed. So to a certain extent, that was what was a little bit confusing to me in the processes that we've seen recently, is that it seemed like the Ethics Commission then was maybe used as the second or third set of eyes on the question. And so it comes down to, well, whose opinion is going to be the one that takes priority? Is it going to be the HR director? Is it going to be the municipal attorney? Is it going to be the Ethics Commission? So anyway, I see all of this to be quite muddied right now. So it would be really nice to come to a point where we understand exactly where the Ethics Commission falls in line of play here when we're dealing with an appointee. And I'm with Mr. Constant. I can't imagine having every single appointee go through some kind of formal process with the commission, when again, most of those questions should have been answered at the point of the person being appointed by the mayor. So I think that, it's kind of, I guess, if it really came down to a difference of opinion between maybe what the municipal attorney considered or maybe what the HR director considered, and they needed kind of, a best 2 out of 3 kind of opinion, then it would certainly be wise to use the Ethics Commission. But again, it just seems like we already have a lot of different people or organizations or groups or departments that are in play here. So it's hard to decide whose final opinion actually matters. So I'm glad we're having the conversation. I look forward to maybe having a little bit more of the pro and con of any way that we do this, having those discussions. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll let somebody else talk on that. Thanks.
Yep, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree on the ad hoc piece of it too. And my first thought was, wow, that would be, quite a workload for the ethics board to take on, and not really though having a sense of how long it takes. It looks like it's considerable, but also because it seems like in most cases, well, there have only been a few where clear questions from members have been raised concerning potential conflicts. And I guess to Ms. Kennedy's point, I had made the assumption as well that there was some kind of declaration concerning potential conflicts for nominees. So some clarification of that process would be helpful. And then I guess I was also assuming too, just from conversations with these last couple confirmations where questions of potential conflicts came up, that even if the assembly can't, or even if assembly members can't make that request directly, I can see where, the administration would be interested in ensuring that the request was met if there was an assembly member, who had raised an issue. So I don't know that that was a question per se as to whether or not there needed to be direct or a mechanism for assembly members to request an opinion. I feel like it's already available. And then just to summarize, yes, on the ad hoc, And I would like, as Ms. Kennedy said, some clarification just on that process of identifying potential conflicts when folks are nominated. Thank you.
Ms. Quinn Davidson, are you in the queue? If you are, you might be muted.
Sorry, Mr. Constant, it took a while to get to the mute button. I didn't intend to be, but I agree with everything that's been stated and don't think there's any reason to do it, as a matter of course every single time. Thanks.
Thanks. And okay, so I have myself in the queue, and I want to speak to something briefly that you said, Mrs. Kennedy. So while it may seem like it's overkill, if you will, or a lot too much to have first an HR director and second a municipal attorney opine, and then maybe even a third asking for the ethics board's opinion. From where I sit, though, it's not that so much. Like the HR director, at least in recent practice now, has turned into quite an advocate on behalf of appointees. And so I personally can't take the opinion of the HR director as a thoughtful analysis. It feels much more nowadays like that's actually another legal counsel making a legal argument on behalf of a client. Second, the municipal attorney too is subject in great measure to political persuasion because that individual serves at the pleasure of the mayor. However, the ethics board, once in position, cannot be removed except for cause. And therefore, if the question to me rises to the level that I need real independent analysis, that's the body that I turn to for that analysis, for myself and for other people as well, because effectively we have done our very best to insulate that committee from the vagaries of political fortune. And so to me, even though we do have strong legal analysis and then the municipal attorney and maybe even a third one, which is the opinion of the ethics officer, which is also a member of the municipal legal department. So the ethics board is actually the fourth step on the parade to getting appointed and confirmed and figuring out if we have an individual whose conflicts are needing to be, what's the new term, sideboarded or having guardrails around or not. And so to me, the ethics board plays a very specific and important role in the process, and that's the nonpartisan, unbiased, unvarnished view. Any other members? If not, then I would love to hear from Ms. Kelly or Ms. Wynn Pearson as well. Yeah, Ms. Wynn Pearson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had two things I just wanted to say quickly. And the first is to encourage the members of the body to be cognizant of how helpful it can be also for appointees to go to the ethics board. And I say this as someone who was once an executive appointee and did not go to the ethics board. And I think in retrospect, in my position serving on the board of ethics, how helpful it might have been to have the opportunity to turn over things that were perhaps not obviously conflicts of interest, but something to consider, like what former business you may own stock in or other things, and sort of how you might be cognizant of sideboarding your own behavior when serving in your role, regardless of how, regardless of position and regardless of any kind of potentially sort of obvious or public appearing conflicts, that it is in fact a very helpful process and something that I think is something that can help every person. I agree with you that it's a tremendous workload for a civilian commission and potentially not necessarily the appropriate step for every single person. But in my experience, there also wasn't this level of vetting that happened at the onboarding staffing level in the way that it happens at the ethics board.
I see Ms. LaFrance is maybe trying to get in the queue. And Becky, I would ask, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Chris, or Mr. Chair, thanks. Nice to see you, Becky, and thanks for all your work. Can nominees request an opinion directly from the ethics board then? Okay, thanks. That's all I wanted to confirm.
So then I'm going to jump back in, Becky, with a question for you and Terrence as well. What about this theory, though, like instead of everyone de facto having to come spend an hour individually with the ethics board to describe the nature of their business dealings and ask for advice, instead we create a requirement that the board provides an opportunity of training and thoughtful review of the issues so that a member can self-determine or the conversation can begin there instead of just kind of left to either done where everybody, all, 50 of them over the course of 3 years, or, just none of them except when required. Why don't we create a requirement that there's a training by you?
Terry, do you want to speak to that? I mean, I think that clearly, I mean, a training would be helpful. I'm thinking of how that directive happens, right? In terms of like codifying the requirement of an ethics training. I suppose you could put it into Title III in terms of requirement for executive appointees, and then would have to consider kind of content and direction in terms of the sufficiency of that training. But I see that Dee has her hand up, and I think she's really the in-house expert that I defer to.
Awesome, Dee, go ahead.
Yeah, and actually, Amy did have had me do an ethics presentation, but about a third of the people showed up. Now, it was during all sorts of things happening. They were brand new. So I think the ethics thing or the training thing component might just be a matter of the municipal ethics officer or the chair to be, but probably should have offered it 2 more times and more people would have showed up. Everybody seemed to want to know. They all seemed to know it was important. And right away, within the first weeks of the new administration, they did certain things that Amy identified right away, like, oh, no, you need to have ethics training. So I would imagine most times municipal managers will be open to that idea, and it's probably the person in my position that needs to be a little bit more. One of the other things I thought of is that to the extent we have a disclosure form, which I thought we did have, that they had, new directors had to fill that out, and I'm not now entirely sure of that, but whatever we got back was not particularly helpful. And what I'm thinking is if we have designed a different form, which says, please outline your past business interests, which interests are you retaining? So a more robust form, which is basically when we have brought people to the ethics board like Dan Zapay and Joe Gerace, is we made them put that stuff in writing so that we weren't just asking them endless questions, so that maybe a form that would flush it out more would be very helpful.
So Dee, on that topic, Terry, I'll get you in 1 minute. One thought that I had, and I had a conversation with members of the administration about this, these positions are not required to fill out a public official financial disclosure, but the public official financial disclosure form does get to a number of these concerns. And so I had suggested that the administration have conversations along the lines of the content that's in that form to get on record internally, maybe confidentially, where and what those conflicts might be, what those investments and other resources. So I think I'm in line strongly with your position that a better form is in order, and there might actually be good models out there that already exist. There are many questions of a personnel nature about those forms. Where do they exist? How are they discoverable? And there's where the ethics board might play an important role, because they have confidentiality allowed under their section of the code. So, Mr. Kelly.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I was going to second that. Yeah, that we, by and large, we, I don't think we have been getting disclosures from the director level positions, and certainly not before they're confirmed. And so, a more robust form that is submitted to the board before confirmation might allow the board to be a part of the process of flagging possible problems. Even if it's for an educational purpose, right? That we see a possible problem that the appointee, the prospective appointee, would benefit from the board's advice. I think that something like that would be helpful and would allow the board to be, to be more proactive about that. In terms of the mechanism, I mean, I think, again, there is no, Ms. LaFranca asked about, like, do you have a direct mechanism as the assembly to request one of these opinions? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is no. You can ask the municipal attorney, you can ask the ombudsman, you can ask the municipal clerk to do so, but the assembly cannot actually, right? And so maybe that's one thing to think about. It's like, should the chair of the assembly have that kind of power to request an advisory opinion about someone else? Should maybe the chair of the Board of Ethics have that kind of authority? But certainly in terms of the question, do you have a direct mechanism to ask that? The answer is no. You have an indirect mechanism, and it would be to ask the municipal attorney or the municipal clerk to request that kind of opinion. In terms of the idea of ethics training, I think it's a great idea, right? And I think it would be very beneficial. And I take Becky's insight of being on both sides of the fence, seeing how the Board of Ethics works, and having been, an executive appointee, that it would be beneficial to do so. As you know, we do training for the assembly, and I think it's helpful, and it's helpful in why go to the Board of Ethics? And this will go all the way back to one of Ms. Kennedy's questions, like, why involve the Board of Ethics? And my experience has been that there's, particularly compared to, say, like an HR director, the code of ethics can be peculiar sometimes, right? And interpreting the code of ethics requires sometimes understanding it in light of sort of like the tradition by which we have interpreted the code over time, the decisions we've reached in the past. And so there are a variety of cases where it seems to me that people have potential conflicts. If we talk about conflict of interest for just a moment, people have potential conflicts that are not necessarily intuitive. So for instance, right, we had the recent appointee who was on a board, right? So, a board of the Alaska Red Cross. Now, as it turns out, the code reads that if you are a director or a board member, even of a nonprofit organization, you are read to have a financial interest in that organization, right? Even if you aren't getting paid, even if you have no personal downstream financial expectation out of it. That's counterintuitive. Right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people, whether they're appointees, whether they're HR directors, necessarily see that. So particularly in gray area cases, the insight that the board has, because we work with the code consistently and because we have enough sort of institutional memory to remember the various opinions and complaints that we reviewed, how we've interpreted the code over time, can give us a unique insight into these possible conflicts.
So I just will take us on a lighter path and welcome your two lovely dogs to the meeting. And then I will ask anyone else if they have questions for folks now. And I see Miss Gwen Pearson, you're on. Are you wanting to speak again? You just popped up.
Oh, no, I apologize. I just exist within an organization where we always keep our cameras on.
It's similar, and you just never know. It pops up. So,
Chair, I
yep.
would like to add a few more comments, so I could. This is Dee.
Sure, Dee, go ahead.
One real quick is on the idea of the form is when I file on behalf, when I take someone to the ethics board, I can waive or not waive confidentiality. And I've taken a strong position with respect to conflict analysis that is not confidential. That's in the public. Everybody needs to know about it. Similarly, if we had a pre-ethics form that they are required to fill out, I think that should be public. We should have access to it and say, wait, I wonder about this and that. So just, I would go on a different bend on that one, that it's going to be in public office or
Dee, you're kind of fading in and out, but I'll take your gist to be that you think the record should be public. And I don't disagree with you, but I think that might take a more substantive code review to get to, because I can imagine an HR person would be trying to say no. And so we might need your help if we're going to go down that road.
Okay, but just, we're already doing it, because under the code, I can file on behalf of anybody, I can bring them forward, and then I can waive, or whoever does the request can waive or not waive confidentiality. So I've granted myself that power in our code. And then the other thing I was just going to say is, you mentioned, that the municipal attorney who can do this. I have always said that the person in my position who's the attorney for the ethics board is absolutely independent of both the assembly and the administration. Now, that is not in code, but just, I never would discuss any opinion or facts with Patrick, nor with any individual assembly member, whether at some point that be wiser to put into code or just make sure you pick someone who understands that I consider the ethics officer absolutely independent of both branches. And we've acted on that.
Dean, while I agree with that, the code doesn't say the ethics officer brings the filing. It says the municipal attorney, the municipal clerk, or the ombudsman.
Right.
And so for sure, there's an area for cleanup in the code there.
Yeah.
And I would add just a matter of theoretical or kind of philosophical perspective that while the assembly may not have the authority to secure the request for that, the clerk does in fact work for the assembly, and the power that's direct that the assembly has if the perception of a conflict exists and no third party has been unable to corroborate that that conflict is not genuine or is just perception, then the assembly has the unequivocal authority to say, I'm sorry, you're not qualified for this position. And so, there are some factors that, push the question of who actually has the authority, just like you suggest, the chief ethics officer versus the municipal attorney, the clerk versus our soft power that translates into firm power to say yes or no. Mr. Gates, you're in the queue. Dean?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm reading the captions provided by Teams, Microsoft Teams. I don't have sign language interpreter, so excuse me if I'm a little off. I was just understanding that people are saying that the assembly members or chair cannot request an advisory opinion. And I just wanted to make sure, though, they could if it's related to their own conflict. I guess it's that they can't request it for somebody else's conflict. Is that correct? The current code of ethics? I was reviewing that 115, 150.
Mr. Kelly, why don't you go ahead and say, because the chat isn't part of the permanent record.
Yes, that is correct. I mean, generally, the idea is that you can always request an advisory opinion about your own behavior. And remember, the idea in the past, the reason why you can't request an advisory opinion for other people's behavior, it was, again, to keep the board from being politicized. The idea is that could be a sneaky way of trying to, file a complaint without filing a complaint about somebody else, right? So the idea is you can request, guidance for your own behavior, but you by and large can't request guidance for other people's behavior, except in those three cases: the ombudsman, the clerk, and the city attorney. And why? And the argument was that there are times where things are happening where people in those more systemic positions can see potential ethical problems that no individual might ask about their own behavior, but that that the clerk or the city attorney, and this is the way it's often worked out, that D, as the ethics officer, spots things that people aren't even necessarily aware is an ethical problem, and then she's able to come directly to the board without trying to, sometimes she's able to get them say, you should go to the board, and they do, but she doesn't have to now, which is really valuable. Now she can go directly to the board saying, in my work in the city attorney's office, I have spotted this problem, or as the ethics officer, I'm seeing this emerge, and I think it's something the board needs to opine on. And so it's been very helpful for us to do so. But yes, assembly members can ask advice for their own behavior, but not for others.
Ms. Wynn Pearson, you're in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I honestly was entered the queue to try and clarify the same piece, which was that the code as drafted, again, 115, 150A is very clear that any public servant can always, or potential public servant, so potential appointee can always request an opinion about themselves. But those who have the power to ask about others are the clerk, the ombudsman, and the municipal attorney. And to your point, Mr. Constant, I agree with you. And we looked at this as we were talking about this in preparation for this meeting. I think the assembly, as the supervisor of the clerk and as the client of the municipal attorney, has the functional ability to request the filing of a request for an advisory opinion in the same manner that the administration would through their representation by the municipal attorney. And I think we're all also circling around this interesting question of what is not in the code that is reflected in how we practice, right? Which is specifically Dee's role, right? And with Dee's retirement, I think that raises some question for looking at the code, the assembly looking at Title I of, what potentially should be in the code that is not there, in terms of, whether it's a new vetting process via public forum regarding a statement of conflicts, whether it is a more formalized ethics officer role, or are we comfortable with the way the code actually dictates that things should operate in terms of those three categories: the clerk, the ombudsman, and the municipal attorney.
So I don't see anyone in the queue. I'll say then, I'll put myself there and say, I think that you really do hit the nail on the head. And Dee, as much as I hate to suggest it, I think there's one more task for you, which is kind of an analysis and memorandum to us, informal is fine, that suggests how you would consider it going forward after we have no longer the benefit of your direct service, and should you choose to accept that mission. And also, I want to ask the question, is there any barrier to the Assembly creating a requirement for some form of a personal or financial conflict disclosure record? I guess that's for the attorneys. I often hear, well, there's some conflict or some reason you can't do that. But I'm wondering if we can, like the legislature has for state elected officials, create a similar requirement for local elected officials or appointed officials.
And Chris, this is Dee. We talked a little bit about this. Is this somehow, if there was going to be a requirement for confirmation, would that somehow be back to our separation of powers issue? Because the ad hoc seems to be the prevailing view here, would requiring a form, a simple form, and the ethics board has generated forms. We have a whole set of them, and I'm not sure that wouldn't pass. Wouldn't be challenged, a simple form for a conflict analysis. So I think again, maybe going through that door versus changing code might be the best way to go.
Would you restate that? I think I missed the essence.
Okay, the ethics board has generated many forms, and those are required under the ethics code for different people to fill out. And we recreate them and we modify them on a regular basis. And so rather than having a head-on battle about whether we can require everyone or again, this more simple approach may simply be develop a form. It's an ethics board form. We do that on a regular basis. And I'm not sure there'd be much objection to that.
Right. So then the ethics board could, in fact, require it from all appointees.
I think so.
Yeah. So that's awesome. That sounds like a good topic to add to your list of potential future changes as you kind of move on to greener pastures. Ms. Kennedy is in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think I just want to add to the possibility of questions that might be asked if we do try to do that kind of a form. And I guess just a comment then is, for me, I think that's probably a wise thing to do for internal conversations, but I would want to make sure that some of that financial disclosure would not be considered public information. One of the things that has bothered me for years in all the public, because I'm an elected official and have been in other positions, you basically have to divulge everything financially about your spouse, about your children, if they're still living under your roof. And, and I just always felt like that was so unfair to the family members. So, but I absolutely understand that it could be valuable information in terms of having that internal discussion about whether or not there's a conflict of interest. So I would just hope that if we begin to go down that route of creating some kind of a form, that it actually stays confidential and is only to be used during those conversations of declaring whether or not there's a conflict. So anyway, just my thoughts on that. That's always been a bit of a pet peeve of mine. And I think it's one of the reasons why in some cases people aren't willing to serve, because they end up dragging their family members into the fray, if you will, and that becomes, I think, an intimidation and, just kind of one of those hurdles that makes it hard to really get qualified people. But anyway, just some thoughts. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and I think that will be an issue of contemplation, as I think Dee suggested, from where she stands, and correct me if I misstate what I heard, Dee, that there is an argument to have this information made public. And I think that that's a conversation worthy of contemplation on all sides. And I think there's an example now where we have an appointee who has delegated personal business to family members. Those family members are still potentially bringing business before the potential appointee. And it certainly raises all kinds of questions that have to be looked at. And so, but the question of whether or not it should be a public record, I think, is a question to listen to the attorneys bat back and forth and then make a rational decision. Anyone else wish to add to the conversation?
And Chris, could I just respond to Crystal?
Sure. Yep.
Crystal, the only difference I would say is that APOC form is 7 to 10 pages long. It's awful. And at one point, the assembly said, why should we fill out another ethics form? We already fill out APOC. And we, the board, said, because we don't want to read that 7 to 10 pages. We want 1 page where you just say, what are your businesses with the, so I really appreciate what you're saying in terms of confidentiality, and maybe we could work on the contents of that form, because it should not be an APOC form. It should not be, your bank accounts, your everything. That form is way too long. So I appreciate what you said, Crystal.
Well, thank you. And if I could just follow up on that a little bit, Mr. Constant, thank you. No, thank you, Dee. And I think it is a fine line. There's got to be a balance in there. But I can remember, asking my 16-year-old son to tell me how much money he made, and, putting that on that APOC form. It's like, people don't need to know that. And, and I don't mind telling certain authorities that maybe do need to know that, but the world doesn't need to know. So anyway, that's just my feeling on it. Thank you.
I see Mr. Kelly has entered himself back in the queue. Mr. Kelly.
Well, first I want to thank everyone for this conversation. Like the last time, it's true, we need to come more often, because it's always an enlightening conversation when we actually talk to this committee. So thank you so much for your time and your insights today. I just want to make sure, so my takeaways from this conversation, from what I'm hearing, is one, it sounds like that the general will is to keep this as an ad hoc process. That is the conflict of interest analysis of mayoral appointees, so that when there's a gray area, or when members of the assembly think, or the ethics officers think that there needs to be a specific analysis of an appointee, a potential appointee, that will keep it as an ad hoc and not make it a universal process. Secondly, it sounds like there's an interest in the board developing some sort of training for mayoral appointees, right, and creating some sort of regularized process for that. Third, it sounds like there's interest in the board creating some sort of fairly simple form that mayoral appointees before confirmation can fill out and submit to the board for review. It sounds like there'll be further debates about whether that should be confidential or non-confidential, but it sounds like there's at least interest in us developing that form. And then fourth, working to firm up perhaps the codification of the ethics officer position, right, with Dee exiting. It is perhaps worth thinking about making that a more formalized position. And I will say, as chair of the Board of Ethics, and having been on the Board of Ethics in a long time, I would strongly support that view. I think Dee's position is essential from an ethics perspective in terms of city government, and we've been very lucky to have her. But I do think as we transition into her replacement, having a more codified position where the expectations are clear would be a valuable thing. If there's any disagreement, but those are my 4 takeaways. If anyone has more takeaways, or if I've misinterpreted something, please let me know.
Well, there was a 5th one, and it's not necessarily directed at the commission, the ethics board, but it's that Dee, if she's willing, provides us just an analysis of where she sees we need to strengthen up and move the process forward as she is on the way out the door. And that can be done in consultation with the Board of Ethics, or it can be just done in her capacity as a municipal attorney. But I think that's the 5th piece of this conversation, is to make available to us your wisdom and on your departure, Dee, on this topic.
Okay, no other topics?
So I am going to take a stab and say then that I'm going to ask the clerk to try to put in our calendar that we do this at least twice a year. And since I'm the chair today, I'm going to ask the clerk to do that so that we just build a system that effectively at least twice a year makes this conversation happen. If there's no objection to that, then make it so.
Yes, we will do that.
Thank you. And is there any last input on this topic?
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to say thanks to the board members for their service and how helpful it is to have those opinions. So thank you all.
I share the gratitude, and I've spoken to it a number of times in the last few weeks, how dependent I am as a policymaker to hear from a body that is protected from partisan pushes and can simply speak to the facts in a very thoughtful and deliberative way. And for that voice, you have my deep gratitude. So moving from there, I guess we have no unfinished business on the agenda. We have one last item on the agenda. It's audience participation. Any member of the public wish to be heard? If you're on the phone, *6 would be the command to unmute yourself. I'm hearing none. Is there a meeting scheduled for December?
Mr. Chair, there is currently a meeting scheduled for December, but I believe we'll be discussing with Mr. Peterson whether he wishes that meeting to be held because it is very close to the holiday.
So on that note, I'm going to assume it's not going to happen, or I probably won't be there because I'm leaving from the 14th to the 24th next month. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Dee, for your service as the chief ethics officer for the municipality. If we won't have a chance to convene again, it really has been a critical voice, done good service to the city, the municipality, and to the future of our community. So thank you, Dee.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, if no one else wishes to be heard, then I'm going to adjourn this meeting. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, thanks. Thanks, Dee.